Alright guys, Murph's here, and today we're going to talk about this, a Ruger Mini14 Tactical, chambered in 223 Remington. Now, in order to talk about this, first let me take off my Wish.com Ranger bands real quick. And let's discuss just a little bit of history, but I don't want to spend too much time on it because this is not a terribly historic firearm. I probably have more personal history with it than there is necessarily a lot of additional history. So, in 1973, Ruger came out with the Mini14 rifle, and it was an attempt to kind of maybe attract some military customers away from the M16 by bringing out a wood and steel rifle chambered in the 223-556 caliber. Now, the select fire variant of this rifle is known as the AC-556, which, if anybody has seen the TV show or movie The A-Team, they are very familiar with the AC-556. It is featured quite prominently in that series. It's also in the movie Face Off, in the prison escape scene. Pretty awesome movie overall. Now, the AC-556 would fail to gain any interest in the American military market. However, it has seen quite a bit of adoption at different times in the police markets in both the USA as well as places like France. Now, the Mini14 has a ton of different variants out there of it, ranging from precision or target rifle type setups all the way to tactical variants, kind of like this one, and a little bit differently. Now, the ranch rifle would come out during this time period, and this rifle would feature the Ruger proprietary scope mount system, or scope, I guess you would say footprint. Yeah, scope mount footprint is kind of what I'm looking for on this one. And this would kind of become an iconic rifle for Ruger overall. This really made it adaptable to your average sportsman. And this rifle came out at a time where there weren't really a whole lot of semi-automatic 5.5 or 223, I guess I should say, chambered rifles. You know, there were, of course, was the Colt SP01, which was the civilian variant of the M16 and the M16A1, and that had some interest, but there are a lot of people who were still kind of thumbing their nose at the plastic and aluminum rifle, and were much more interested in something made of wood and steel, and kind of had that same M1 Garand M14 type feel to it. Now, eventually in the 70s and into the 80s, we would see the Valmets come online. And that kind of, it was a foreign gun. They didn't really do that well. It looked a little too military. And this is a time where military type arms don't necessarily have a following. Then in the 1980s, when AKs start coming in, well, you know, that's a communist gun. We can't have stuff like that. We need American guns. We need American wood steel rifles. So that, it kind of further pushed along the popularity of the Mini14. And that would remain that way all the way up into the 90s, where once we had the Gun Control Act, the 1994 Gun Control Act, which established a 5-point system for assessing whether or not something was an assault rifle. The Mini14 was not really affected by that. It didn't have any of the features but one, which was a detachable box magazine. Now, for the most part, these rifles would come standard with a 5 or 10 round box magazine, but 20 round magazines could be gotten. They would be pre-banned magazines because the 1994 assault weapons ban also banned high capacity magazines, but that was just new production. You could still have old ones. So that made the Mini14 a very popular rifle during that time period, something that you could still get a hold of. You could use it for sporting type purposes, and if you wanted to, you could use it for defensive type purposes, as was demonstrated by, unfortunately, quite a few ne'er-do-wells who got a hold of them and used them against law enforcement. Now, that more or less covers this rifle and kind of causes us to segue into something that looks far more tactical than your average wood-stocked Mini14. Now, something else I will throw out about Mini14s before we get into this, you can find them chambered in a variety of cartridges, along with a variety of stock setups. They have been made in, obviously, 223, 300 blackout, 6.8 SPC, and then there's also a 7.62x3.9 variant known as the Mini30. Not really in the scope of today's video. Now, let's talk about this rifle specifically. Now, we have a 16-inch barrel, pretty much standard. You can see that this particular muzzle is unadorned. This is a little bit older of a tactical variant of the Mini14. The present models that have been coming out, which don't necessarily have the stock, do have flash hiders on them. This one does not, and I've just never really bothered putting one on it. We'll get into that more here after a little bit. Now, as we can see here, we have a protected 3-prong front sight with a central blade. This actually would get adapted onto the rifle in 2003. Now, a couple of major changes occurred in 2003, and you can find these on the post 580 prefix serial numbers, and that was the adoption of the 3-prong front sight off of the Ruger PC9 and PC40 carbines, as well as this barrel profile, which is a little bit heavier than the standard Mini14. The original Mini14 had a fairly lightweight profile, which is supposed to keep it as a kind of trim and handy rifle, something that can be put into a classification of being able to compete with like a M1 carbine. This adopted a little bit heavier profile so that you could get better overall accuracy out of it. Now, in addition to that, the scope footprint of the ranch rifle became more or less standard on those post 580 prefix rifles. So that's kind of where we get some of the attributes of the core parts of this particular rifle. Now, coming back to our handguard up here, we of course have something to protect us from not only the internal working parts, because this is kind of a modified M14 action, which is a modified M1 Garand action, but it also keeps us from burning our fingers on the barrel. As you can see, we have some Picatinny rails. We have 3 short sections attached around the front of the rifle, as well as 1 continuous section attached to the handguard. I have actually removed and lost the previous handguard that came on this gun. This is an add-on. I was going to update some things about this rifle and was planning on using the top cover. However, I never got around to them, so now it's just kind of hanging out on the rifle. You can see here I have a Firefield laser light combo with a green laser and a whopping 180 lumen flashlight. This kind of sets a theme for the accessories on this rifle, and we'll talk about that more as we go. Now, coming back to our optic, we have a straight 4-power 4x32 optic with a mil-dot reticle from BSA. This scope costs less than like $100. We have the standard proprietary Ruger rings. The rifle came with 2. We have a Garand type rotating bolt. Our chamber is technically .223 caliber. However, this rifle will take 5.56. Pretty much all the Mini14s except for the target rifle are rated to be able to take 5.56. Definitely something that's worth looking into, but that is Ruger's kind of stance on the Mini14 when it comes to the 5.56 chambering. Now, this would originally have a peep type rear sight. The rear sight was another design update on the post 580 prefix serial numbers. It's a little bit easier to adjust over the original Mini14 sight. Also, the original Mini14 just had a single blade front sight with an aperture rear sight. Not a bad sight overall, but this is definitely more reminiscent of an M1 Garand type sight, and that's my preferred sight picture overall. Now, obviously, with this scope here, I cannot fit the rear sight. I've got it sitting in the baggie in the gun room. On this side of the rifle, we have a small plunger to be able to lock the bolt in the rearmost position. In order to be able to unlock the bolt, you just pull back on the charging handle a little bit. Now, something to keep in mind, guys, Rugers do use cast receivers, and a lot of times whenever someone says cast receivers, they start thinking back to like Century Arms, C39s and stuff like that, and immediately they start thinking about cast trunnions and a lot of the issues that happen there. Ruger made its business on cast gun parts. They are incredibly good at casting, and when casting is done right, it is a cost-effective, expedient method to be able to produce high-quality firearms, as long as your quality control is there. And historically, Ruger's quality control has been very good. Now, our magazine release is our magazine is a rock and lock type setup, and our magazine release is kind of set in the same place that you would find on like an M14, or very similar to an AK, but not nearly as pronounced. Now, as I said, originally these would come with 5 and 10 round magazines. This particular rifle came with a 20 round magazine, and I have a variety of magazines for it, as you can see. Now, coming back to our safety is located in front of the trigger guard. And this is something that gives a lot of people some cause for concern, but it's set up very similar to how the M1 Garand was set up. And a lot of people become very concerned whenever it is that you're taking the weapon off safe and your finger is already in the trigger guard. However, if you look at a lot of the current training, you're bringing the rifle up and moving the weapon off of safe so that you can immediately fire. So it's really not a bad placement for that overall. Now, you could make an argument of what if I'm covering a doorway or something like that and I want the weapon ready to go, so I've already taken it off as safe. Well, if you're making that conscious decision to take it off as safe, you should also be making that conscious decision of keeping your finger straight until you're ready to fire, because you've removed that positive block. Now, ultimately, all of it comes down to a certain amount of comfort with the weapon system. If you're not comfortable with yourself to be able to positively manipulate that safety and operate the weapon system at the same time in a dynamic type environment, you probably shouldn't be running the weapon system in a dynamic type environment. And you either need to pick something else, or you need to train with the rifle to be comfortable to be able to do that type of thing. Now, for somebody coming off of like an AR-15 or an AK or something like that, I could definitely see how maybe you would fumble a little bit with the safety. So if you're coming off the AR-15 looking for something to use your thumb to be able to rotate the selector with, and with an AK you're looking for a very gross motor movement or something like that off the side of the receiver. I could see that being a little bit confusing, but that's just a trainingism you're going to have to get through. Now, when we look at our sling options on this rifle, there are 7 different sling placement options on this rifle, which is a little ridiculous, and the vast majority of them are some type of kind of like sporting rifle type sling setup. We haven't got a place for QD cups or anything along those lines. Now, as you can see, I have a 2-point adjustable Blue Force gear padded sling. I really like these slings. Makes it very easy to be able to adjust my sling length on the fly so that I can maneuver my body around the weapon system. Now, we come back to our pistol grip here. We have, overall, this is an ATI stock setup, right? This is a collaboration between Ruger and ATI to be able to bring out a more modernized Mini14 to compete with the AR-15. Now, overall, I am not really big on kind of splitting hairs between pistol grips on different types of modern sporting rifles. I haven't found them to be terribly important like I do in a pistol. However, I do have to say that this grip kind of reminds me of like an A2 pistol grip where you have that bump, and I can't stand that. It rubs my fingers and really causes a point of irritation for me, so I've actually been Dremeling all the A2 bumps off of my pistol grips, and this kind of is reminiscent of that for me, and is not nearly so easily solved with a Dremel or even easily replacing this pistol grip. Now, on this side of the rifle, we have a button that allows us to be able to collapse the stock. And this is actually one of the things that attracted me about this rifle, being able to collapse it down into a very compact fashion. We also have a AR-15 style stock with adjustable length of pull, and a rubber butt pad that we can remove if we want less contact surface, which I have never really found that to be troublesome with this rifle. I actually kind of like how it mates with my shoulder. It's fairly comfortable, and apparently, there we go, somewhat difficult to put back on. Now, this did originally come with a cheek riser. I have removed it, and it has become lost to time. It's floating somewhere out in the world. All right, guys, there's our features. So, how does it shoot? Historically, out of this rifle, I have a couple thousand rounds. Honestly, I have owned this thing for years, and I have gotten anywhere from as low as 1.5 inches to pretty consistently around 2-inch groups out of it overall. Keep in mind that Mini14s generally are not renowned for their accuracy. The post 580 serial number range improved with this barrel. However, they're not lauded for accuracy. Now, if you spend enough time looking at print media and all that kind of stuff, you'll find plenty of people talking about how their rifle is, how their Mini14 or whatever rifle it is that they're reviewing is sub MOA. Apparently, there's not a single non-sub MOA rifle out on the market right now. I find that uninteresting because the majority of the time those guys are conducting their accuracy testing with high power scopes that you wouldn't necessarily use on the rifle in your day-to-day uses. So I test my rifles based off of actual practical optics setups that I intend to use the rifles for if I ever have to use them defensively, which is why we have this scope on it. All right, guys. Let's start talking through my experiences with this rifle. I want to start off with a little bit of my personal history, which will kind of help you better understand why it's set up the way that it is. So in 2009, I decided that I wanted a defensive rifle. I wanted my first defensive rifle. I walked into a gun shop and I saw this sitting on the wall. It did not have any of the stuff added to it yet. It still had its original iron sights on it. And decided that since I had grown up shooting a Mini14 and had way more experience with it than I did the AR-15 at that point, that this was the rifle that I wanted to be my defensive rifle. Especially with this telescoping and side folding stock, it was something that I could compact down and would be excellent as a truck gun, because at the time I was absolutely infatuated with the truck gun concept. And really, that has continued on into the present day for me. So this was my first truck gun approach. Now with that, I have grown with this rifle. I have changed so many of my thoughts and opinions on how rifles need to look and be set up and what price points are that you should have for different accessories that you put on your rifle and all that kind of stuff. I have changed my opinion drastically since 2009. So now, this rifle is really not indicative of my thinking. There's a lot of issues with trying to run this rifle in the same way that you can run an AR-15. First off, magazine changes. So, when it comes to trying to do an efficient magazine change, it's actually incredibly difficult. So, you can attempt to do the cool guy, sweep out your old magazine with another magazine and then rock in the new one. However, this magazine catch is rather small for that. It's not a lot of surface area to try to hit. You can get extended latches, which if that's something that interests you, then I guess absolutely go for it. But I've never been terribly interested in trying to do that. Now, a more common method currently is to go ahead and snag up your next magazine. I'm not going to pull any more out of that. Snag up your next magazine, sweep out the old one, and rock in the new one. Which is relatively efficient, and you even have last shot hold open, so it would be, you know when the rifle runs empty, unlike most of your AKs, and it would be fairly quick order to get it back into the fight. However, at this point, I'm really kind of fighting the weapon system in order to be able to run it as well as I can any of my AR-15s. Well, why haven't you updated the optic, Murph? Well, I thought about it, but this has kind of fallen out of my overall use. So my wife winds up shooting this a lot, and she has no problem with this 4x32. Now, what made me pick this 4x32 power optic to begin with? Or 4x30, excuse me. Well, a friend of mine bought one several years ago, and I noticed that its power level, being 4 power, it's the same power as an ACOG, and it actually has about the same visibility at 100 yards as an ACOG does. So I looked at it like a sub $100 ACOG. And then I even had the mil dot in there, so I had some ranging capability to be able to try to hit targets at greater range. I've got a sub $100 ACOG at that point. Now, the reality of the matter is this optic is not as durable. The adjustments for zeroing are not as crisp. I have knocked them loose multiple times. It's a lot of effort to try to zero this optic. I'm glad I've had it set for several years now. I haven't knocked the turrets at any point in the last couple of years, so that's been nice. And even though these are locking turrets, it's not terribly difficult to get them unlocked, unfortunately. So it's not a serious defensive fighting rifle for me, but my wife still likes it, which is why it's still here. That's the same reason that I haven't done anything with the light, because neither one of us are using it for serious use. It's actually just kind of something to play around with every once in a while, to take out to the range and enjoy our time. Now, when it comes to magazines, I mentioned before that it was originally sent out with 5 and 10 round magazines. 20 round magazines could be resourced, and they were even factory magazines. However, anything greater than that capacity for many years was hard to come by. Ruger didn't have a lot of interest in building high capacity magazines for the Mini14. This is a 30 round Pro Mag. I also have a 40 round Pro Mag sitting right here. Gotta be completely honest, these are a little sketchy. And when they're fully loaded, I found it's very difficult to lock them in place on a forward bolt. I have to bring the bolt into the rear position in order to be able to lock these into the mag well. Not very encouraging. Now, I do have 2 20 round Ruger mags and 1 30 round Ruger mag. And then I also have a Tapco magazine, which I can also tell you from experience does not like to feed with steel cased ammunition. Now, Murph, why are you shooting steel case out of your rifle? Well, because I can find it. We're coming off of another ammo rush, and this rifle has actually lived with me through 3 different ammo rushes now. So it's not outside of the realm of possibility that at some point I've had to run steel case through this gun. Now, in the early days of owning it, this rifle did not like steel case, and I actually had some significant hard malfunctions with it. The shell expanded in the chamber, and I tore off the rim with the extractor and had to completely deadline the rifle until I could get a cleaning rod down the bore to punch that round out. In most recent years, I've not had that much of an issue. I guess it was a little bit of a break-in with the rifle, and I have found Rugers to sometimes be a little finicky in the early stages with steel-cased ammunition. It's actually pretty much been my experience with every Ruger I have, rifle-wise at least, that at first they kind of hesitate on steel, but after you get a couple hundred rounds through them, they start to loosen up a little bit, and then steel runs flawlessly. I have actually had some of my best accuracy out of this rifle with Wolf 223, 55 grain ammunition. Surprised me as well, believe me. But with that ammunition, I've been able to take this thing out to 400 yards on headshots all day long. That's pretty good for Wolf ammunition in the Mini14, if I'm being honest. Alright guys, what are my long-term plans for this rifle? Honestly, I don't have any. At this point, it kind of just occupies the space. It's something that my wife likes taking out from time to time and putting some rounds through, and I do still enjoy looking at it in my collection as it hangs in its rack, and looking at it and then a lot of the other rifles that are around it, how I have progressed in my knowledge as a shooter, how I have advanced to have a better understanding of what does and does not work for me, and different efficiencies that are born from that. And I guess in a lot of ways, I keep this around. I have considered selling it multiple times, but at the end of the day, I keep it around as kind of a reminder of where I started and where I'm headed. And that's an important thing to kind of keep in touch with. You know, a much younger version of myself thought that this was going to be the gun that I would go to defend myself with. And now a much older version of myself realizes that this is the gun that taught me what would be better suited for my defensive type needs. And that's a certain introspective aspect that we can't ever really overlook as shooters. We have to keep pushing ourselves to develop to be better and challenge our preconceived notions as to what is good and what might be better for us in the end, why certain trends are popular and why maybe they deserve a little bit more of our attention instead of being stuck in our own ways and not necessarily progressing. If we just continue to do things because that's how we've always done it, we would still be using leeches to get bad blood out of people, or doing cocaine because of the ghosts in our blood. Like, we're at a point now where innovation can spur us to do better, and all we have to do is just take the chance, you know, try something new and see how it goes. All right, guys, that's pretty much my thoughts on this particular rifle. I hope you guys found this video interesting or helpful, and have a good day.